Yes, it's 2023, and yes, I bought myself a GTX 780 Ti. I mostly bought it for decoration, but of course, I want to see how well it performs. So this is the GTX 780 Ti, and I recently purchased it mostly just for decoration and to add to the collection, but I wanted to see how it performs as part of my tech catch-up because this is a generation that I missed. It was released in 2013 by Nvidia as a flagship GPU, which is now 10 years old, and it only came with 3GB of VRAM. Now that's quite important today, probably back when it was actually created that was perfectly fine, but it's really going to limit the card when it comes to modern gaming. Its biggest rival would have been something like the R9 290 from AMD, and we recently checked out one of those on the channel. We had one for a while, which actually performed exceptionally well. But unfortunately, that has not been passed on to this card. When this card arrived, I did what I normally do. I loaded it up into my test bench and it worked perfectly fine. We managed to install the drivers, we managed to run a few synthetic benchmarks, and the card was perfectly happy doing all of that. Then I transferred it to our benching rig, which is a much higher and newer system, and I just couldn't get a display picture. I tried everything to try and get this card working. I cleared the CMOS, I reinstalled the card again and again, I did a full DDU on the system just in case, and still I could not get a picture. So then I took it out, tried it in another system, and it worked perfectly fine. The other system was an AM4 platform with a slightly older CPU, so I wasn't really sure what was going on. I then moved it back to the benching rig and it worked perfectly fine. Unfortunately, since actually removing it from that system again, it's just returned a little bit more flaky and won't load up, and I can't remember exactly what I did to get it to work, so I'm actually not going to be re-benchmarking this again because it's just a bit of a pain. That is a bit of a shame really, because the card is a gorgeous looking card. It is a Founders Edition, so it's on the blower style cooler, which is much louder than the AMD counterparts, I will admit. When this thing is running in full throttle, you can hear it clearly through the case, and it's providing more sound than anything else in the system. What it also doesn't share with the Radeon R9 290 is its compatibility when it comes to modern games. Both cards don't have any support from drivers anymore. Nvidia did stop supporting this one a long time ago, and that clearly shows in the testing that we did. I threw our normal test suite against this card just to see what it could do, and unfortunately I couldn't even get that many games to load. Most games actually had issues when it came to lack of driver support. They would just throw up warnings saying that it needs a newer driver version than the one that's installed, and we did have the latest one that is available to this card there, and because there are no drivers that we could upgrade to, it just wouldn't let us start the games. We did though manage to get 3 of those games actually starting, even though 2 of them did still throw up a bit of an error when it came to drivers, and to be honest, the performance wasn't brilliant either. Red Dead Redemption 2 was one of those games that would actually start. It didn't give us any kind of real VRAM issues when we were in the settings, as long as we set it to something like a 1080p low. But it did give us a warning on drivers when it actually tried to start the game. You could just actually press continue and get past it, and the performance was okay. You could actually get away with playing that game, getting an average of 55 frames per second with a 1% low of 41. That's perfectly fine. You could play that game through, but the game didn't look great because of the low settings, so it probably wouldn't be ideal for most people. The second game that we managed to get started was Spider-Man Remastered. Now that is a much more modern game, but we still did get a lot of warnings when we actually tried to load the game up, particularly when it came down to drivers. We didn't get any VRAM warnings with this game, and to be honest, it kind of started perfectly fine. You could get into the game, but the performance wasn't really great either. Running the game again in 1080p with a low preset, we managed to get an average of 51 frames per second with a 1% low of 33. Again, that meant the game was more than playable, but the experience wasn't great because that game actually does look gorgeous and it really deserves a bit more quality when it comes to that picture. The biggest surprise though was of course Cyberpunk 2077. Now this game didn't give us any issues at all starting. There were no actual driver issues when you started it. There was no warnings at all to say that it was an old driver. We ran into no VRAM issues at all. It actually, as long as you just configured the game correctly, it just loaded and it started perfectly fine. In a 1080p resolution with a low preset, we managed to get an average of 37 frames per second with a 1% low of 31. Now that is quite surprising because the game is usually really demanding, but this card actually managed to handle it and you could play the game through. It didn't look great, but it was reasonably smooth because the 1% lows were pretty close to the average frames per second. And for anybody out there that likes or prefers a 30 frames per second cinematic kind of experience in their games, it would have worked for you, so you're probably going to win with that one. Now, due to the incompatibilities with this card and its lack of drivers, I kind of gave up trying more modern games. I didn't want to try anything like Super New from 2023. One of the games that we did try was, of course, The Last of Us Part 1. It is part of our normal test suite. But again, just like all the others, it just wouldn't start. You just got an instant warning saying your drivers are too old and you need to update them. And of course, there's nowhere to go. So you're pretty much stuck if you want to play anything like that. So instead, I decided to actually try some older games, do a bit more of a tech catch-up and see what kind of performance this card would have got, at least if you're trying to play something a little bit more retro. Up first, we have Call of Duty Ghosts. Not a modern game by any means, but still a great one to play if you ever get bored. Released in the same year as the GTX 780 Ti, of course this game should have run well back in the day, and it still does now. In 1080p with a high preset, we managed to get an average of 162 frames per second with a 1% low of 92. More than enough for anyone wanting to play this game, and plenty of room to even push that resolution up. Dead Island 1 is up next, and although the game was originally released back in 2011, it took another 5 years for it to properly come out to the PC, in the form of the Definitive Edition. This is the edition that we tested on the GTX 780 Ti, and it provided a great playing experience, getting an average of 110 frames per second with a 1% low of 81 in 1080p with a high preset. Now, as Doom Eternal gave us issues during testing, not allowing us to even play the game in 1080p at all due to the VRAM issues, we decided to take a look at its predecessor instead. Doom 2016 is a great game, it is well optimized and it looks good too, and this really showed within the testing. In 1080p with a high preset, the GTX 780 Ti managed to get an average of 107 frames per second with a 1% low of 73. The game ran very smoothly and also looked amazing too. It's been a long time since I've properly played Grand Theft Auto 5, and if you're someone who has never played it, you should really give it a go. It's even better that you can play it perfectly fine on an assortment of older hardware, and the GTX 780 Ti is no exception. With a resolution of 1080p and a high quality preset, the game looked great and it ran beautifully, getting an average of 124 frames per second with a 1% low of 99. Considering the low price of cards such as this now, there really isn't any excuse anymore not to at least give this game a go. Up next is of course Left 4 Dead. I included this game as more of a replacement for Back 4 Blood, which simply wouldn't run on the GTX 780 Ti, as it is pretty much the same thing. As with any older Valve games, it is highly optimized and is no issue to run on most hardware, and the GTX 780 Ti is no different. Getting an average of 490 frames per second in 1080p with a high setting means you have more than enough to play with here, and to be honest, you could even run this game in 4K with no problems at all. The last game in our testing was Tomb Raider 2013. Tomb Raider is another game that released in the same year as the GTX 780 Ti, and is also another well-optimized title, so of course the GTX 780 Ti had no issues in providing a great gaming experience. Getting an average of 192 frames per second with a 1% low of 143, you could easily increase both the quality preset and the resolution and play the game fine. It is a smooth experience and it's a lot of fun to play too. So there we have it. The GTX 780 Ti in 2023 is not a great option for many, particularly if you want to play more modern games or at least anything in the last 3 or 4 years. Older games, it works perfectly fine, so if you are building a retro PC and you can manage to get one of these cheap enough, it could kind of make sense, but there are far better options out there, particularly in the budget market, even new sometimes, that you could go for. I managed to pick this card up for about £30, which in my opinion is probably £30 too much, particularly for the performance that it gives today, but it's going to make a great decorative piece for the studio and it's going to go perfectly fine in the collection. I have purchased more NVIDIA graphics cards from this kind of range upwards, so we're going to be getting to testing them soon, so make sure you subscribe to the channel if you want to catch them. But for now, this card is going to be settled on the back wall for you guys to see in the future.